Sup, and welcome to a random review, where today I am reviewing a movie that I watched without knowing the slightest thing about beforehand. All I had heard was that it was good. Otherwise, I was kind of mystified about what it could be about, based only on its title. I didn't know if it was a war movie, a fantasy movie. I had no idea. So, I decided to address that by sitting down and watching 2022's The Banshees of Inisherin, which was directed by Martin McDonagh and stars Colin Farrell and Gleeson. This movie, as it turns out, is about a man named Padraic, played by Colin Farrell, who lives on an island just off the coast of Ireland called Inisherin in the year 1923. And one day, out of nowhere, Padraic discovers that his best friend in the world, an older man named Colm played by Gleeson, has decided that he no longer wants to be friends with him. And it's not because Padraic did or said anything bad to him, it's because, in his own words, he realized he simply doesn't like him anymore. A statement which, as you can imagine, devastates Padraic. And the bulk of the movie is about Padraic trying to understand why his friend has cut him off like this, and hopefully rectify his relationship with him. So, to start, I love how low-key and relatable the premise of this movie is, and how it's handled with both total seriousness and deadpan humor, but with the humor not undercutting it. I appreciated it because there are an infinite number of Hollywood movies about guys who get dumped by their hot girlfriend and then spend the rest of the movie wallowing about it and trying to get back with them. But there are considerably fewer films that deal with the nature of friendship strife and what it's like to lose a friend, which can be just as crushing as getting dumped by a significant other. And in this case, the movie does a wonderful job of accentuating Padraic's agony by setting this movie on a sparsely populated island in the middle of nowhere, where he cannot avoid Colm and at a time in history where there's no internet or TV to distract him and expand his worldview. It's brilliant because it elevates how painful this is for Padraic. Colm isn't someone he can just ignore. This is someone who he has to see all the time. Someone who goes to the same pub that he does and interacts with all the same people that he does. He's one of the only other people that lives on this island. And so, unless Padraic decides to move, which his sister suggests to him, this is something that he has to emotionally confront, in one way or another. The acting in this movie is phenomenal. Colin Farrell does a really good job of portraying someone who is very nice and pleasant, but who has just enough personality flaws that you can kind of get why someone might not necessarily want to interact with them every day. And it's an impressive balance that he pulls off, because it'd be very easy for him to come off as whiny and annoying instead of sympathetic, since he is basically complaining non-stop throughout the entire movie. Likewise, Gleeson does a great job of bringing humanity to Colm, because at first, you think you're gonna be against this guy the entire time for doing something so harsh to someone who cares about him, but the more the movie goes on, the more we can understand why he's doing this and where he's coming from, even if we ourselves wouldn't ever do this to someone who liked us this much. The other actors do a great job as well, and all the primary characters in this movie are all unhappy with their place in life. None of them like where they are in Inisherin, for one reason or another. And so the movie is essentially about these people reconciling with their place in life, reconciling with their loneliness and depression and isolation, but not being able to do it because they don't know how to do it with each other, because none of them are at the same wavelength as each other. What one person means to someone else and thinks of someone else isn't what the other person thinks of them. And so, it's through this movie that you get a good appreciation of how resentment and feuds can build, even when it's between people who you'd think would care about each other more than they do other people. This is the type of movie that, when you're done watching it, you might find yourself later thinking about it as an analogy for some of the things that you see happening in real life. And that's the best thing about the Banshees of Inisherin to me. It is very thought-provoking. It forces you to see this story through both Padraic and Colm Larry's sides. This movie doesn't lionize Padraic, even though it starts off with him as like the victim. It wants you to ask yourself if the other person is in the right too. If not perhaps more in the right or being more reasonable than Padraic himself. So, I kind of loved the first half of this movie. Everything about it just kind of worked for me. How nonchalantly it started, how not melodramatic the tension was, how gentle and whimsical the music was, how there was an element of humor throughout all the scenes, and how unique this movie was. I was really digging the Banshees of Inisherin up until about 2/3 of the way in, because in the second half of the movie, there's a tone shift, and things get more serious, and things do get melodramatic, and maudlin, and the humor starts to go away. And once all of that began taking place, my enjoyment of this movie began to dissipate a bit. I really didn't like watching where this story went. But what makes this movie complicated to review is that the things that happened in it that I didn't like are things that I wasn't supposed to like, are things that were done intentionally for us to be upset about. To explain this, it's critical to understand one of the themes of this movie. And I'm not going to spoil this movie because I don't do that in these reviews, unless it's a piece of dreck like the last thing I reviewed. But I do feel the need to warn you that what I'm about to discuss is kind of a spoiler, in that this theme becomes very explicit by the end of the movie. And so, if you know about it before watching it first, it might alter the way that you interpret the movie. So, there's your warning. All throughout the movie, there are these little moments, these little scenes, where the characters briefly acknowledge that there is a civil war taking place on the mainland of Ireland, on the other side of the water. And those scenes are very brief, but they are very important, because the conflict between Padraic and Colm Larry is meant to be analogous to what is happening in that civil war. To put it bluntly, this movie becomes about how dumb war is, which is kind of ingenious when you think about it, because it's an anti-war movie without actually being about war at all. It's very subtle. When you watch the escalation that takes place in this movie, you're gonna find yourself thinking, this is so dumb. These characters are so dumb. These people would be so much happier if they just hashed this out with each other or went to therapy. Like, this is so unnecessary. But that's what war is like. Not all war, but the overwhelming majority of it. And so, there is very much a purpose to where this story goes. What happens in the final act of this movie is very intentional. My issue, though, with where the story goes is that, to me, it betrays what this movie was initially about. The Banshees of Inisherin begins as an examination of depression and loneliness and existential longing. But by the end of the movie, it's no longer about that. It becomes a tale of obsession. And these characters stop being relatable. They start doing things that we wouldn't do under any circumstances. And to a large degree, they stop being likable. Like, I didn't really care about either of these people by the end. And again, I understand why the movie did this, but I felt like in the process of them doing this, all the deeper elements of the story, which were the best parts of it, didn't carry through. The first parts of the movie didn't dovetail well enough for me with the last parts of the movie. The characters go too far. It becomes too easy to not take them seriously after a while. And so, the last 20 minutes of this movie didn't really do anything for me, because it wasn't teaching me anything new about these people, other than how far they were willing to go. It felt redundant after a while, because the only thing that was really changing was the scale of what they were doing. The only other gripe that I have with this movie is with the character of Mrs. McCormick, who is one of Padraic's neighbors. She pops up throughout the story, and she is a very literal presence in it. And to me, it's one of these things where, again, I get what the movie was going for with her, and I'm not going to say what it is, but once you figure it out, it's honestly distracting. Like, to me, this was the movie being too clever for its own good, because the whole purpose of the story is that this setting is supposed to be grounded and believable, and yet she isn't. And so she muddies the waters in a way that was unnecessary, in my opinion. This story did not need a quasi-mystical character like her. And in fact, if you took her out of the movie entirely, outside of her first scene, in which you could have just substituted her for another random character, the movie wouldn't miss her at all, and it would have focused more on its two main characters, whose initial motivations deserve more attention anyway. That said, the Banshees of Inisherin is clever, and it makes it a little tricky for me to give a score to, because some of the things I didn't like about it have positive ulterior meanings. On the one hand, I really didn't enjoy the last act of this movie. The Banshees of Inisherin is a little under 2 hours long, and I was really feeling its length by the end. It became too much of a soap opera for me. And like I said, it gets maudlin. It loses way too much humor. On the other hand, it's a memorable soap opera, and a lot of the movie, before it wore out its welcome with me, is excellent, with really terrific performances and a very interesting premise. And so, in spite of its flaws, I still think this is a movie worth seeing, because even though it's uneven, its highs are very high, and it does get you thinking. If you like having discussions with people after you watch a movie, this is a great movie to watch with other people, because even if you don't 100% like this, there's a lot to sink your teeth into and analyze about it. It's fun to comb through whether or not you think Padraic was more in the right or Colm Larry was more in the right. Which is why I'm going to give this a score that's higher than some movies that I probably enjoyed more than this, just because I think there's more to it. I give The Banshees of Inisherin a 7.9 out of 10. It's an interesting, memorable movie. Some people thought it was the best movie of 2022. I wouldn't go that far at all, but it has a high ceiling, so your mileage may vary.